Always have to change. Permanent revolution in television. There's a few new segments and new people you're going to see. And one new segment is Robert Spencer, Jihad Watch, wonderful scholar and author and activist. And we have him on the show a great deal. This is my thinking. There are lots of issues around Islam that I don't think justify a complete segment, but we'd like to round them up and discuss them. So each week, probably every Thursday, Robert Spencer will be on the show to make himself and me even more hated than we are now. Robert, welcome to you.
Always a pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
Let's begin, actually, by something which is quite chilling, and millions of people, I mean millions of people, have now seen this video. We're going to show it in a few moments' time, just a bit of it. Some of it is too graphic. And it is what's happening in Syria. Many people think this is about good and bad, black and white. It's far more complex than that. A group of police officers who were captured by the rebels in Syria. I want you to listen to what they're chanting, and we'll tell you exactly what they did, and you'll see some of it on this video. Let's take a look now, please. And then they shoot them hundreds and hundreds of times, and then they literally shoot their heads off. And one guy, he's dead, and they shoot him till the head comes off, chanting, "God is great, God is great, God is great." Robert, these are not people fighting for secular liberal democracy, are they?
No, they aren't. And that's what makes it really so appalling that Barack Obama has agreed to aid them. The news just came out yesterday that he had signed a secret agreement. And yet, it's very clear that this group in Syria that's rebelling against the Assad regime, and of course, there's nothing good that can be said about the Assad regime, but the fact is that it's Muslim Brotherhood, it's Al-Qaeda, they're going to introduce Islamic law in Syria. The Christians know this. The Christians are being victimized all over the country. 9,000 Christians have fled their homes. Christians are being forced to leave areas or convert to Islam all over the country. There are chants of Allah's victory is near and the armies of Islam set us free from these supposed pro-democracy rebels. This is not a group that the United States or any free country ought to be aiding.
Mm-hmm. You get occasional glimpses of this in mainstream media. I have to say, occasionally the BBC, for example, has mentioned this. They've spoken to Christians and secular people and Druze and Alawites who said, we're terrified. You mustn't just think the rebel army is full of these wonderful, heroic freedom fighters. It's very different from... Let's move on to... It's Ramadan, and it's always fascinated me that there are many Muslims who say, well, we need certain compromises during Ramadan. You have to indulge us a little. You know, they invaded Israel Yom Kippur, for goodness sake. Anyway, Ramadan has been traditionally, and is now, it seems, a time for quite grotesque levels of violence.
Yes. And see, what's funny about it is that there are always Muslim spokesmen at the beginning of every Ramadan, and they say Ramadan is a time of peace, reflection, a time to reconcile differences and seek peace. This was one that came across the transom from Barack Obama himself. And yet, the fact is that we always see more violence in Ramadan. And this year, there's been a sharp uptick of violence against Muslims in Muslim countries who are not observing it. And people think, well, they're just not being consistent when they say it's about a time of peace. Actually, they are. It is a time of increased piety, and that means it's a time of a Muslim group in Bulgaria taking credit for the massacre of the Jews there recently. They said Ramadan is a month of holy war and death for Allah.
Yeah.
For fighting the enemies of Allah and Allah's messenger, the Jews and their American facilitators. This is all consistent as far as they're concerned because Allah tells them to fight the Jews. Allah tells them to wage jihad against the infidels. So when they grow more pious and more prayerful during Ramadan, they also grow more violent.
Yeah, I wish we were showing it now, actually, but we're not. Some of this is rather outdated video, and we saw some still pictures there that were a little misleading. But we have had, for example, in Thailand, in parts of the world you don't always think of as of Islam, where non-Muslims have been attacked and murdered. It seems to be a time for triumphalism rather than peace and compromise.
Well, very much so. And this is because of basic elements of Islamic theology, that because Islam mandates warfare against unbelievers, and these mandates are couched in religious terms, when Muslims grow more religious, then those who are violent-minded to start with are going to think, well, Ramadan is an excellent time to wage jihad against infidels.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk about this event is it Sweden? I'm not aware of this. It just says here, Swedish Geller Spencer event, leftist thuggery and journalistic bias. It sounds very sexy. Well, what's it all about?
Well, Pamela Geller and I and a number of freedom fighters from all over Europe are converging in Stockholm over the weekend, where we're going to have a march in commemoration of the failed jihad plot that was 1 year ago this Saturday in Stockholm. And what's remarkable about this is that we're simply standing for freedom against violence, intimidation, and jihad violence. And yet leftist thugs have already announced that they're going to counter-protest. The police are going to be out in force. We're going to have guards, of course. We've heard now that there are going to be 1,500 violent protesters from the so-called Antifa group, which is supposed to be against fascism, but is actually quite fascist and thuggish. The Swedish media has been sending us all sorts of "when did you stop beating your wife" kind of questions.
Yeah.
And they are portraying us as, of course, the villains, as the mainstream media always does. And so it's going to be an interesting weekend in Stockholm.
Yeah, well, interesting is one way of putting it. Lastly, we haven't got too much time, but the Arab Spring in Egypt, there are many people, I think rather naively, who assumed that some of those in Tahrir Square, they would be in charge. It now would be a secular, progressive society. We're seeing the direct opposite. If anything, it's more oppressive than it was under Mubarak.
Yes. Well, I think emblematic of the real change there is that Sheikh Qaradawi, after having been barred from Egypt for 40 years, the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, he came back to Tahrir Square a few months ago. And Wael Ghonim, who was the great hero of the so-called Facebook revolution and the techies and the Western secular pluralists who were supposedly driving this revolution, the Qaradawi's people didn't allow him on the stage. And there was a bigger crowd for that event than there was all through the demonstration. And so it's clear. Morsi, of course, the new president of Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt, is doing just what we predicted all along and pursuing a belligerent course with Israel and the Islamization of Egypt.
Mm. We're going to have you back every Thursday. There's a lot we need to discuss. We didn't even go into some of the Canadian issues that we have here because there are so many developing really by the day, by the week. But I said this before, I so appreciate what you do and your courage. And thank you, my friend. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. I look forward to it, Michael.